The autumn air of 1991 brought a chilling silence to the outskirts of St. Petersburg, concealing a horrifying secret deep inside. A park worker walking along the isolated riverbank stopped dead in his tracks, staring in absolute terror at a dark shape ahead. There, half submerged in the cold, murky water of the river, lay the lifeless body of a young girl, ruined by time. Investigators examined the tragic scene, discovering a bizarre and precise cut along the fabric of the victim's torn nylon stockings. This single unnatural detail would soon become the terrifying trademark of a calculating predator haunting the gloomy forests of Leningrad. Welcome back to the studio. The case we examine today is a dark chronicle of deception, betrayal, and absolute official corruption. In 1991, the historic city on the Neva River officially reclaimed its imperial name, changing from Leningrad to St. Petersburg. Yet, beneath the grand architecture and political rebirth of the city, an invisible monster began his quiet, deadly campaign of terror. The initial medical examination of the young victim was conducted with severe negligence, attributing her death to a mere tragic drowning. Local authorities identified the deceased girl as Ira Barsukova, who had vanished without a single trace weeks before her body appeared. Because the corrupt system desired low crime statistics, no criminal investigation was launched, allowing the serial killer to walk completely free. Exactly 1 year passed before the peaceful silence of the Nevsky Forest Park was violently broken by another horrifying discovery. A young couple walking near the isolated Black Creek stumbled upon the hidden body of a second young teenage female victim. The body belonged to Olia Vasilyeva, an innocent orphan girl who had been brutally stabbed multiple times in her vulnerable neck. The striking similarity between the two crimes forced the police to admit their fatal mistake and form a dedicated homicide task force. Detectives realized the terrifying reality that a calculating serial killer was hunting young, defenseless schoolgirls on the fringes of the city. Months of intense field investigation passed without a single lead, until a third body was discovered in early March 1993. The unidentified female victim lay frozen in the snow, her nylon stockings sliced open in the exact same sadistic, ritualistic manner. Rumors of a phantom monster operating inside the forest spread like wildfire through the streets, causing mass panic among local families. To capture the elusive predator, the task force decided to leave a secret marker at every single location where a body was found. These hidden bottles contained precise geographical notes, acting as silent traps if the killer ever returned to his favorite hunting grounds. The investigation took an unexpected and dark turn when detectives began questioning the close classmates of the deceased young girl, Tanya. A young schoolgirl nervously revealed that Tanya had been stopped inside a local metro station by a stern, authoritative uniform officer. The officer had allegedly accused her of fare evasion, demanding her phone number and arranging a private meeting outside the station. This critical revelation sent shockwaves through the task force, suggesting the horrifying possibility that the monster was one of their own men. Detectives focused their covert attention on the Lomonosovskaya metro station, a unique architectural space built with a horizontal lift design. A comprehensive audit of the local transport police unit quickly narrowed the suspect list down to 2 distinct patrolling officers. The first suspect was Senior Sergeant Pavel Shuvalov, a quiet, unremarkable family man who seemed completely invisible to his colleagues. The second suspect was his more active partner, who possessed a private vehicle, making him highly capable of transporting victims long distances. The tactical focus shifted heavily towards Senior Sergeant Pavel Shuvalov, whose cold, quiet demeanor perfectly matched the psychological profile of the elusive forest predator. With no direct physical evidence to justify an immediate arrest, investigators desperately designed a highly dangerous covert sting operation to catch him. The homicide task force recruited a brave 18-year-old female decoy named Lida, preparing her to walk directly into the jaws of danger. Because the dangerous predator specifically targeted vulnerable adolescent teenagers, the team turned to professional film makeup artists to transform her appearance. Using specialized Soviet-era chemical adhesives and subtle techniques, the artists successfully altered her face, making her look like a helpless young schoolgirl. On a freezing morning, the young undercover operative took her designated position near the crowded entrance of the Ploshchad Lenina metro station. Pavel Shuvalov was patrolling the Grand Stone station that day, his eyes constantly scanning the rushing crowds for an easy, isolated target. Lida intentionally stepped near the heavy mechanical turnstiles, deliberately acting confused and deeply distressed about her lack of a transit token. The patrolling officer noticed the seemingly vulnerable young schoolgirl immediately, his quiet demeanor instantly shifting into a dark, opportunistic focus. He approached her with a calm, gentle authority, offering to bypass the security gates if she provided her personal telephone number first. The young female decoy complied perfectly with the complex plan, speaking softly and successfully, scheduling a private rendezvous later that evening. The designated location for the dark meeting was arranged at the crowded crossroads near the historic Ploshchad Vostania station downtown. Several experienced surveillance detectives waited in unmarked vehicles nearby, keeping their hidden cameras tightly focused on the target area. Pavel Shuvalov arrived exactly on time, now completely stripped of his official uniform, wearing ordinary, dull civilian winter garments instead. He greeted Lida with a soft, hypnotic voice that seemed designed to completely disarm any natural sense of deep panic. Instead of guiding her toward an isolated park immediately, the highly suspicious predator began walking her through highly populated public avenues. This tactical anomaly deeply confused the trailing surveillance team, who struggled to keep their unmarked vehicles close in dense city traffic. Suddenly, without any prior warning, Shuvalov guided the young girl sharply into the pitch-black entrance of a massive concrete apartment block. The heavy wooden entrance door slammed shut violently behind them, automatically locking with a dense, commercial-grade electronic security mechanism. The tracking detectives immediately jumped from their vehicles, sprinting toward the locked entrance, completely blind to what was happening inside. Inside the cold, silent stairwell, the predator stared deeply at the young girl's legs, his obsession instantly reaching a boiling point. He quietly inquired why she was not wearing black nylon stockings, his low voice dripping with a bizarre, unsettling disappointment. To maintain the critical deception, Lida quickly lied, promising that she owned a perfect pair at her home nearby. Outside the building, the desperate detectives initiated a brilliant distraction, loudly banging on the security doors to simulate a drunken brawl. The violent racket startled the cautious predator, forcing him to abort his immediate plans and quickly lead her back outside. Shuvalov immediately hailed a passing official city taxi, pushing Lida inside, before instructing the driver to head toward the isolated suburbs. The surveillance cars swarmed the moving taxi, desperate to prevent the predator from reaching his dark, ritualistic execution grounds inside the forest. Sensing an invisible trap closing in around him, the clever serial killer ordered the taxi to halt abruptly near a metro station. He abruptly abandoned the sting operation entirely, disappearing into the crowded transit system and leaving the covert team with empty hands. The failed trap left the homicide task force in complete despair, realizing their elusive target was far more dangerous than they ever imagined. The disastrous failure of the underground sting operation shattered the team's confidence, leaving the task force with deep psychological exhaustion inside their offices. Detectives gathered under the dim fluorescent lights to reconstruct their damaged investigative timeline from the absolute ruin of their initial hypothesis. Senior Sergeant Pavel Shuvalov returned to his regular patrol duties the following morning, completely unaware that his dark secrets were being exposed. Homicide detectives thoroughly audited the transit registries, cross-referencing precise duty schedules against the exact dates of every single missing young girl. A terrifying mathematical pattern slowly emerged from the records, placing Shuvalov at the exact platform during each abduction timeframe. The tactical command refused to leak their breakthrough to local precincts, enforcing total operational secrecy to trap the highly suspicious officer. Forensic experts simultaneously re-examined the biological evidence recovered from the body of the fourth victim, searching for crucial DNA matches. Scientists extracted distinct skin particles trapped beneath her frozen fingernails, confirming the brutal predator possessed type 2 blood classification. Medical personnel covertly ordered a mandatory health evaluation for all local transit officers, pretending to check for winter flu outbreaks. A female nurse carefully collected blood samples from Senior Sergeant Shuvalov, sealing his fate inside a single glass laboratory tube. The lab results confirmed the match with absolute certainty, locking the quiet patrolman directly to the horrific forest executions. The operational group waited for the optimal moment to strike, monitoring his movements through 24-hour covert mobile surveillance teams. Shuvalov finished his exhausting night shift at dawn, walking slowly toward his ordinary apartment complex located in the industrial outskirts. Heavy winter fog crawled across the bleak courtyard, blinding the neighborhood as the heavily armed capture squad quietly surrounded the building. 4 plainclothes operatives slipped inside the dimly lit stairwell, tracking the quiet hunter as he ascended toward his top-floor home. Shuvalov reached for his heavy iron apartment door key, his featureless white hands trembling slightly from a sudden, unexplainable instinct. Before the key could turn, the operatives violently tackled him against the concrete wall, pinning his massive frame instantly. Heavy steel handcuffs locked tightly around his thick wrists, the metallic snap echoing loudly down the empty, cold concrete corridor. The captured serial killer offered absolutely no physical resistance, dropping his featureless white head into a posture of complete submissive silence. They quickly shoved him into the rear seat of an unmarked vehicle, speeding away from the industrial complex before sunrise. A separate technical team immediately entered the abandoned apartment to execute a meticulous, micro-detailed forensic search for hidden hunting trophies. An operative wearing white latex gloves carefully lifted an old brass desk lamp, examining the dark dust patterns along its base. Another detective carefully peeled back the heavy corner of an old wool rug, illuminating the cold wooden floorboards beneath. They slowly opened the top drawer of a scratched, dark wooden cabinet, revealing a collection of neatly organized personal belongings. Deep inside the cluttered kitchen closet, detectives pulled out a heavy cardboard box, overflowing with a terrifying collection of steel knives. Investigators counted over 20 distinct sharp blades, each carefully maintained and hidden beneath stacks of ordinary domestic kitchen utensils. The most damning piece of physical evidence was found deep inside the bottom of a rusted metal garbage container. The operative retrieved a heavy pair of official militia regulation steel handcuffs, heavily stained with a dried, ink-like dark liquid substance. Serial numbers engraved on the steel links perfectly matched the official equipment issued directly to Senior Sergeant Pavel Shuvalov himself. Armed with absolute forensic proof, the task force prepared to face the unmasked predator inside the cold interrogation room of the precinct. The heavy wooden door of the isolation room clicked shut, sealing Pavel Shuvalov inside a stark space under a sickly white glare. The captured officer sat rigidly in his chair, his featureless white head turned downward away from the cold gaze of investigators. Detectives silently placed a thick cardboard box onto the wooden table, its side heavily dented and stained with dark dust. With a deliberate slow motion, an investigator pulled out a heavy pair of official militia regulation steel handcuffs from the container. The polished steel links clinked sharply against the rough wood, their silver surfaces heavily stained with flakes of dried black substance. The investigator pointed directly at the stamped serial numbers, demanding an immediate explanation for the presence of his personal equipment. Shuvalov stared intensely at the stained metal, a thick, suffocating silence descending over the cold interrogation room for several minutes. A detective reached into a dark folder and spread out 5 large black and white photographs across the scratched table surface. The horrific images detailed the brutal execution sites inside the Nevsky Forest Park, capturing the tragic end of each innocent victim. The sight of the crime scene evidence broke the suspect's rigid defense, causing his pale face to flush with intense stress. In a voice that suddenly degraded into a harsh, wheezing whisper, Pavel Shuvalov finally began his detailed, chronological confession. He quietly admitted his identity and official rank, before stating his direct involvement in multiple unsolved abductions across the province. The cold narrative dragged investigators back to 1968, into the bleak concrete landscape of an ordinary Leningrad neighborhood. The young boy was raised exclusively by an overbearing mother and an aging grandmother inside a small, suffocatingly dark room. Because of frequent childhood illnesses, he spent long, isolated months indoors, completely severed from any normal peer interactions. His authoritarian mother enforced absolute submission, daily imposing strict domestic rules and punishing the slightest signs of childhood independence. During the freezing winter of 1980, his mother discovered him attempting to secretly escape his morning chores before school. She abruptly blocked the narrow exit corridor, her tall silhouette casting a dark, terrifying shadow over the trembling child. With an aggressive gesture, she pulled a pair of heavy, thick-ribbed girl's tights from her deep coat pocket. She sternly demanded that her 12-year-old son wear the embarrassing female garment to protect his fragile health against the frost. The young boy desperately rebelled, crying out that his classmates would relentlessly mock him if they discovered the secret clothing. The mother calmly extracted 2 highly coveted movie tickets from her purse, establishing a cruel, unyielding domestic ultimatum instead. The rule was simple and absolute. Either he complied with her demands, or he would be denied any cinematic entertainment. Defeated and deeply humiliated, the child quietly retreated into his dark bedroom to put on the thick, elastic fabric. He hid the embarrassing secret beneath his heavy wool school trousers, carrying a massive weight of psychological terror into the courtyard. Later that afternoon, during a chaotic recess period behind the school building, a group of aggressive older boys surrounded him. A violent scuffle erupted in the snow, and a malicious bully suddenly noticed a strange dark fabric near his ankle. The cruel children burst into loud, mocking laughter, violently tearing at his trousers to expose the hidden girl's tights completely. With absolute malice, the lead bully violently pulled the torn elastic fabric over the young boy's featureless white head. Trapped in darkness beneath the suffocating fabric, something inside the child's mind permanently snapped, setting a path of blood. The interrogation intensified as Pavel Shuvalov described his first fatal encounter inside the dark, isolated brushwood of the vast Leningrad Forest Park. In 1991, the predator encountered a young teenage schoolgirl near the isolated perimeter of the freezing Chernaya River bank. Utilizing his official authority, the uniformed officer easily lured the vulnerable child away from the safety of the main public transit gate. He promised to guide her through a dangerous shortcut, leading her deep into the dense, foggy maze of bare birch trees. Once completely hidden from public view, the quiet predator suddenly turned onto his victim, pins her instantly with overwhelming physical force. The defenseless young girl struggled desperately in the freezing mud, her silent cries completely muffled by the vast, dense wilderness around them. Shuvalov extracted a heavy steel pocket knife, methodically slicing open her nylon stockings to fulfill his dark, deeply rooted childhood obsession. To destroy any potential forensic evidence, the calculating killer violently forced her head down into the murky water of the river. He held her body down without a single flicker of emotion, waiting patiently until the desperate bubbles completely ceased rising to the surface. Shuvalov abandoned the lifeless body in the dark current, walking calmly back to his regular patrol station as if nothing happened. The investigators inside the cold room listened to the wheezing voice, horrified by the absolute lack of remorse in his words. He explained how his second execution followed an identical pattern, targeting another young teenage orphan girl inside the same gloomy woods. Shuvalov explicitly described how he utilized his official uniform to instantly gain the absolute trust of his innocent, vulnerable targets. To the helpless young schoolgirls wandering the isolated metro stations, his dark blue militia uniform represented absolute safety and state protection. They never suspected that beneath the prestigious brass buttons of the Soviet state lurked a sadistic, highly calculating serial murderer. The cold confession continued for several hours, with Shuvalov detailing the exact locations where he hid his third and fourth victims. He possessed an extraordinary navigating memory, recalling the environmental details of the forest park with absolute mathematical precision 20 years later. The operational group immediately organized a heavily secured convoy to transport the serial killer back to the dark execution grounds. The winter caravan moved silently through the industrial outskirts, entering the frozen, white-covered maze of the vast Nevsky Forest Park complex. The convoy halted near the banks of the frozen Chernaya River, where a thick layer of snow concealed the tragic secrets. Pavel Shuvalov stepped out of the vehicle, his thick wrists heavily chained together by the stained steel handcuffs found in his trash. Surrounded by heavily armed military guards, the quiet predator guided the investigative team down a narrow, wind-swept forest trail. He walked with a chilling, calm confidence, pointing his chained white hands directly towards specific unmarked spots beneath the snow. Detectives extracted heavy metal shovels from their equipment trucks, methodically digging through the frozen crust of the muddy forest floor. As the iron blades struck deeper into the wet earth, they unearthed the hidden glass bottles left as secret police markers. An investigator carefully retrieved a buried glass bottle, clearing away the wet leaves to expose the folded note preserved inside. The presence of these secret markers verified his confession with absolute certainty, proving his direct presence at every single execution site. Shuvalov stood completely motionless in the snow, watching the unearthing of his crimes without a single tremor of human feeling. The comprehensive field verification was completed before nightfall, solidifying the legal case against the corrupt state officer with absolute proof. With the evidence secured, the monster was returned to the city to await the unyielding judgment of the provincial Supreme Court. The judicial proceedings against Pavel Shuvalov commenced behind the reinforced steel doors of the Saint Petersburg Supreme Court under heavy armed security. Angry crowds of local citizens gathered outside the grand municipal building, demanding the immediate restoration of the Soviet-era capital punishment law. Inside the cold, packed courtroom, the former senior sergeant was secured inside a reinforced steel cage, isolated from the public. Shuvalov abruptly altered his legal strategy, violently denying his entire previous written confession and claiming extreme physical coercion from detectives. He loudly stated before the Supreme Judge that the entire criminal case was a fabricated conspiracy designed to destroy his reputation. The chief prosecutor calmly presented the thick manila dossiers containing the forensic field verifications and the discovered hidden glass markers. The court clerk methodically displayed the stained steel handcuffs recovered from his apartment trash bin, showing the distinct engraved serial numbers. Shuvalov maintained a stubborn, cold silence as the undeniable forensic laboratory reports linked his blood type directly to the victims. The grieving mothers of the deceased young schoolgirls sat together on the front benches, holding framed black and white portraits in silence. The devastating testimony of Lida, the brave undercover operative, detailed the terrifying moments inside the dark concrete apartment stairwell complex. The defense attorneys desperately attempted to argue mental incompetence, claiming the defendant suffered from severe, unrecognized chronic psychological delusions since childhood. A designated panel of state psychiatric experts quickly dismissed the claim, declaring Pavel Shuvalov fully sane and legally responsible. The Supreme Judge unrolled the heavy parchment document containing the final judicial verdict. the dense room falling into complete silence. The criminal court convicted the former militia officer of 5 separate counts of first-degree murder and multiple aggravated sexual assaults. The legal gravity of his brutal actions justified the absolute maximum penalty available under the updated post-Soviet Regional Criminal Code. The Provincial Supreme Court sentenced Pavel Shuvalov to suffer the ultimate penalty of death by a state-firing execution squad. The severe announcement brought a wave of quiet relief to the packed gallery, with the victims' families weeping in silence. However, the chaotic political landscape of the late 1990s introduced an unexpected legal barrier to his immediate execution. The newly formed government implemented a strict, mandatory moratorium on all capital punishment cases across the entire nation-state. Because of this modern legal shift, the serial killer's death sentence was automatically commuted to life imprisonment without parole. The unpunished monster was heavily secured and transported far away from Saint Petersburg, headed toward an isolated high-security penal colony. The dark caravan traversed the frozen wasteland, carrying the calculating predator toward the legendary penal zones of Mordovia. The designated destination was a notorious maximum security fortress built specifically to permanently contain the nation's most violent, sadistic criminals. Shuvalov was locked inside a small, freezing concrete cell, completely isolated from any meaningful contact with the outside world. He spent decades sitting in total silence beneath a single flickering light bulb, his dark mind consumed by unfulfilled predatory fantasies. During mandatory interrogation reviews, the unrepentant predator shockingly admitted that his unfulfilled plans involved capturing multiple victims simultaneously. He explained with cold calmness how he desired to chain one young schoolgirl to a bare tree trunk inside the forest. He wanted to force her to watch the brutal, systematic execution of her helpless classmate before completing his dark ritual. The absolute depravity of his written statements terrified prison guards, confirming that the monster could never be severely rehabilitated into society. The quiet serial murderer remained locked behind the iron bars of Mordovia, completely stripped of his rank and authority permanently. The iron prison gates of the isolation wing closed heavily behind him, sealing Pavel Shuvalov away from the memories of St. Petersburg forever. Inside the frozen cells of Mordovia, the quiet serial killer spent his remaining years in total, uninterrupted isolation from other inmates. He sat rigidly on his narrow wooden bunk, his featureless white face staring blankly at the rough, damp stone wall before him. The slow, heavy ticking of an old prison corridor clock measured the steady passage of his long, unrepentant decades in darkness. Shuvalov never requested a single judicial pardon, maintaining an absolute, quiet arrogance regarding the horrific forest executions he committed. Meanwhile, far away in the city, the surviving victim, Olga, continued to suffer from the intense, lingering trauma of her encounter. She frequently woke up in a cold sweat, her mind flooded by the terrifying memories of the dark, misty birch forest. The image of the neat, vertical slice on her black nylon stockings remained permanently burned into her broken childhood psychological memories. Olga completely altered her personal path, changing her family name and moving away to isolate herself from the historic metro stations. Even decades after the final Supreme Court trial, she absolutely refused to step near the Lomonosovskaya transit platform out of fear. She always carried the deep psychological certainty that the unmasked uniform predator was still standing inside the dark, waiting for her. The passage of time brought no relief to the grieving families, who frequently visited the desolate banks of the Chernaya River. They quietly placed small bouquets of colorful winter flowers onto the frozen mud, honoring the tragic memory of their innocent schoolgirls. The dense Nevsky Forest Park remained a permanent monument of psychological terror, its vast wilderness retaining the chilling secrets of his crimes. The old local hotel for transit truck drivers was permanently closed down, its concrete walls collapsing into complete decay over time. Rusted iron chains and broken wooden planks blocked the desolate perimeter, a dark reminder of the killer's hidden geographical hunting patterns. The modern investigative archives preserved the thick paper dossiers of the task force, ensuring the dark historical case would never be forgotten. Forensic students thoroughly examined the typed registries, studying the unique vertical stocking incisions as a distinct signature of sadistic psychopathy. The official equipment registries of the transport district kept his original registration file, marked with a dark purple administrative seal forever. In the freezing winter of 2021, Pavel Shuvalov finally expired deep inside the cold infirmary of the Mordovian penal colony. The unrepentant predator died in total obscurity, his body buried inside an unmarked prison grave beneath the deep Russian permafrost. The official administrative record was sealed with a final medical stamp, permanently concluding the dark chronicle of the Forest Phantom. The public transit lines of St. Petersburg returned to normal operation, the rushing passengers completely unaware of the past official corruption. The grand stone arches and marble pillars of Lomonosovskaya station reflected the bright, sterile fluorescent lights of a new generation state. Yet, for the veteran homicide detectives who managed the painful task force, the psychological scars of the case remained forever unhealed. They carried the heavy weight of knowing that an official guardian of the state had transformed into a ruthless executioner of children. The tragic narrative of Pavel Shuvalov stands as a stark, chilling historical reminder of the absolute depravity hidden behind a uniform. The frozen waters of the Chernaya River continue to flow silently through the dense birch trees, washing away the physical evidence of time. The unknown victims finally found a heavy, silent peace beneath the white winter snow blankets of the vast Russian landscape. The grand architecture of the old imperial capital stood tall against the changing winter sky, burying the horrors of the 90s deep beneath the frozen soil. The final judicial seal permanently locked the dark case, ensuring the memory of the innocent schoolgirls would remain protected throughout history.